Why is it that some folks seem to just be naturally great managers, while for other folks, it feels like being a fish out of water? Even with all the emphasis on developing managerial skills and mindsets, there is something else going on. And today's guest explains that being successful in a job isn't just about the skills. It's also about your attributes. Today's guest is Rich Diviney. Rich is a best-selling author, leadership and human performance expert, and retired Navy SEAL commander. As the officer in charge of training for the elite SEAL teams, Rich was intimately involved in the highly specialized selection process, which pared down a group of already exceptional candidates into a small cadre of the most elite, optimal performers. During this work, he gained insights and passion for writing about the innate qualities we all possess, resulting in his first book, The Attributes: 25 Hidden Drivers to Optimal Performance, which is exactly what we discussed today. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. New interviews are released every week. Now here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rich. I'm super excited to talk about this concept of attributes, which is similar to some things I've heard about in the past, but you lay it out so beautifully in your book. So I'm really excited to learn with you and from you today. So welcome.
Well, thanks, Mamie. Thanks for having me on the show, and I'm excited for our chat.
So why don't you start by explaining what are attributes, what's the concept of attributes, and how is it different from, say, skills or competencies or experiences or all the other things that we might be thinking about when we're thinking about what makes for a good person in our workplace, a good team member, a good person to fill a role?
Yeah, it came to me. I was a Navy SEAL for 21 years, and I was running SEAL training, a selection and assessment for SEALs, and I was trying to determine what were those qualities that told us whether or not a guy was ready for SEAL training, and it seemed to be different than whether they could shoot or scuba dive or skydive, and so I recognized the idea that there's a difference between knowing how to do the job and having what it takes to do the job. And a real quick story that I was given by one of my my old instructors was, he told me that years ago a SEAL student or a candidate showed up to SEAL training and walked in the instructor's office and said, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And they said, okay, well, you need to do a swim test. And so the kid said, fine. And so they took him out to the pool. It was an easy test. So 50 meters, 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. And the kid gets all ready. He jumps in the pool. And as soon as he jumps in the pool, he sinks right to the bottom of the pool. And he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches that and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. He comes up. He's gasping for air, nearly drowning. And the instructor looks at him and says, what the heck are you doing? And the kid who's trying to catch his breath, looks at the instructor and says, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. At that point, the instructor pauses and he looks at the kid and says, that's okay. We can teach you how to swim. And so why did the instructor say that? He said that because he knew if that kid had the qualities to show up to Navy SEAL training without knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be easy. And so I began to bifurcate skills and attributes, and just to really the real quick difference is skills are not inherent to our nature. We're not born with the ability to throw a ball or ride a bike or swim. We're taught, trained to do those things. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. Here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then they also are very visible. So they're very easy to assess, measure, and test, which is why we get seduced by skills when we're performance evaluating or hiring or anything like that. And you can put skills on resumes, or you can put stats and scores around skills. But skills don't tell us how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. And that's when attributes come in. Attributes are inherent to our nature. So all of us are born with levels of situation awareness, adaptability, resilience. We can certainly develop those things over time, sure. But anybody you can see any of these attributes in small children. Anybody who's had small children or dealt with small children will agree with me when I say that there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient, right? So there's a nature nurture element to attributes. Attributes inform our behavior rather than direct our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. So my son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're very difficult to measure and assess. How do you assess someone's levels of adaptability or situation awareness or patience, right? But the idea is if we're ignoring attributes in our performance picture, we're ignoring one of the most important parts of what causes and allows human beings to perform the way they do, not only in every day, but also in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. When when the plan doesn't go as anticipated. And that's what managers and leaders need to be concerned about when they're building their teams.
Oh my gosh, yes, because the work life today is more stressful and more uncertain and more complex than probably ever, right? We say that all the time. It's more than ever, but
Yeah.
it's kind of true.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love this separation between things that kind of everyone can learn and things that are more innate to you and are maybe honed over time or kind of but they're really like they're who you are, and as you said, that kind of how you show up in those situations. You also just said that they're really hard to assess. So maybe just go into like, well then great, it's nice to have a concept, but if you can't assess it, then what good is it? So how do we start to assess either our given teammates that we already have or a potential new hire if this is what is so important in terms of bringing the right people onto our team?
Yeah, I think first thing we have to understand, I think it's important for us to and the audience to understand that these attributes, we all have all of the attributes. Okay, so nowadays in the book I talk about 25. With businesses and teams, we actually have a list of 41 now that we work with. All of us have all of them. Okay. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. Okay, so take adaptability. Adaptability, I would be about on a 1 to 7 scale, I'd be maybe a level 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's very easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow. Now, they're still adaptable because all human beings are. When you're lower, there's just stress and challenge in there, right? But if we were to line up these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own individual performance. And so one of the things we have to understand is, we all come to the table with a unique set of attributes, which defines our performance very uniquely. I always like to think and say like human beings are like automobiles, okay? But some of us are Jeeps, some of us are Ferraris, some of us are SUVs, and there's no judgment there because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. It behooves us to understand and lift our hood and figure out what we're running with. Okay. Now, the way we assess, the best way is during stress, challenge, and uncertainty. This is when these attributes really become the most visible and visceral, because in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, it's very difficult to apply known skills. So things like adaptability and situation awareness all come to the fore. We can see them very, very visible, which made SEAL training a perfect environment for me, whether I was going through it or running it, to see these things. But every human, we all go through stress, challenge, uncertainty, and all it takes is for us to observe our own behavior, or even if we can't observe it in the moment, to look back on it, to say to ourselves, okay, well, listen, in that situation where the environment was changing and things were delayed, or the client was mercurial or whatever, how adaptable was I? How comfortable was it for me to shift and move? How situation aware? So it's really, the idea is, first we encourage people to learn the language of the attributes, the language of performance. Learn about these things, and once you start learning about them and understanding them, and the cool thing is, it's all words, it's all normal words. There's no like new language. No, people know what adaptability is. People know what situation awareness is, right? But once you start seeing these attributes, it's kind of the blessing and the curse, is you can't unsee them. You see them everywhere, and you start to look at performance very differently. You say, well, when I see low performance in this person on my team, I'm not seeing someone who can't, type or file papers. I'm seeing lower patience or lower decisiveness, things like that, or higher creativity, things like that. And so it allows us to actually put much more of a deep and thoughtful picture on performance, and allows us to see potential in human beings that otherwise might have been blind to us. And that's really important as well. As leaders and managers, we want to be able to see potential in our teams, so we know, hey, I'm flagging that person for the next position or promotion because I'm seeing things in them. They might not need those things right now, but I'm seeing these things in them that could help them in a new position or role.
I wonder if you have any stories of yourself or from your clients who have kind of used this and really seen new things in their people, or kind of understood their people in a different way.
Yeah. Well, so one story just from my personal experience, I was commanding officer of a SEAL team, SEAL command. And at one point I had, many people, in my span of care. I had part of that was a supply department. My supply department had 8 people or so in it. And one half of it was focused on future acquisitions and kind of research and things like that. The other half was focused on logistics and administrative things and log keeping and things like that. we had a sailor who was in the futures portion of it, and she was grossly underperforming. She was really not doing very well, bringing down morale. And so what I did, and I had already done this attributes work as training officer before. So I brought her into my office and we began to talk. And within 10 minutes, what I recognized was that her unique attribute set was completely mismatched to what we had her doing. And it was completely perfectly matched to this other thing, this other side of the supply department. All I did was shift her over and her performance skyrocketed. And so it's an example of sometimes it's not necessarily about someone being a bad or low performer. It might just be because their unique attribute set is not congruent with what we're asking them to do in the moment. And so it allows us to also reposition teams. And then when we work with clients and, and companies, what we help them do is figure out, okay, what attributes are we looking for in our team or organization? Because every team and organization is going to have a different unique set of attributes. The attributes that are required for a great Navy SEAL team is going to look different than the attribute list required for a great sales team or a surgical team. So what does that list look like? And then start looking at each other as a team and say, what do we all bring to the table? We can't all bring all of them. So the great thing about teaming is we all bring unique qualities and we start to mesh and zipper these qualities together so that we actually run as a high-performing team. And we've allowed and enabled teams and organizations to understand this and really take their performance to the next level because they can begin to really synergize and lead and perform in a way that supports and buttresses each other in a way that really allows for extremely high performance.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense, right? It's another way to really leverage our unique differences to build something stronger together. All right. So we've been talking about attributes and you've named a couple of them. Can you now just give us the lay of the land of the various attributes? And I know you kind of group them. So either give us the groupings and some examples or pick some of your favorites and kind of lay them out for us.
Yeah, I sure will. So, and it's grown. So in the book, I have 5 categories and 25 attributes. Since publishing the book, which was in 2021, we've now expanded that list to 9 categories and 41 attributes. And so let me just, a couple of categories. So one of the categories, and it's in the book as well, is the grit category. And grit is funny because people think of grit as a singular attribute. They describe it as a singular thing, but grit is not a singular thing. Grit is a combination of things blended and catalyzed and stewed together to create grit. Angela Duckworth, I'm not sure if you know her work, but she wrote a great book years ago called Grit, and she basically said the same thing. It's a combination of stuff. So the attributes that combine to create grit are courage, adaptability, perseverance, and resilience. Those things, those levels of things, those things create the gritty person. Those are all really interesting attributes. But what I think the most interesting is courage, because people say, well, what does courage mean as an attribute? And people can get a little bit confused about that. Courage as an attribute is not necessarily our job in life. Now, one could say, well, Navy SEALs, they're highly courageous. And that may be true. However, that's not what the attribute means. Courage is literally our ability to step into our fear and discomfort. And we know that when we experience fear and anxiety, our autonomic arousal goes up. When that happens, our brains offer us 2 choices, and we know those choices: fight or flight. Okay, and whether or not we pick one of those choices, it's a specific switch in our brain. So if we choose to fight, i.e., step into our fear, we in fact get a dopamine reward for that. Right? That's why we're encouraged. Nature has encouraged human beings to step into our fear. So all this means is that can be that's a very subjective thing for every human being. In other words, you can have a group of Navy SEALs in a gunfight with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and they can literally be feeling less fear than the 8-year-old you just asked to step in front of the classroom and introduce themselves. Okay. So courage as an attribute is not about what you do. It's about, or for a living, it's about how often and habitually do you step into your discomfort. So you can be a genuinely anxious person in life, but if you're stepping into your fear and discomfort consistently every single day, multiple times a day, you have high courage, right? And so that's how we want to think about the courage attribute. It's not about what we do. It's about how often and habitually do we step into our fear and discomfort. So that's one attribute I think is cool. The mental acuity attributes is another category, how our brain processes the world: situation awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability and discernment. My favorite one on that one is task switching, because people often confuse task switching with multitasking, and multitasking, we know neuroscience has proven that it's a myth. We can only focus on one thing at a time, right? And people debate me on this, by the way. They say, well, I can drive my car and listen to my podcast. And The problem is it doesn't count, because it doesn't count when you've relegated that other thing to your unconscious mind. The reason why you can drive your car and listen to your podcast is because you don't have to think about driving your car. But if you are driving your car and listening to your podcast and someone swerves in front of you and you have to take evasive maneuvers to avoid that person, you'll have to rewind the last 15 seconds of that podcast because your brain will have hopped, right? But all this to say that people who are high on task switching are the people who can actually shift their focus between categories and contexts in their environment fairly rapidly and efficiently. They can go from the conversation to the phone call to the email. They can kind of shift rapidly. Where lower task switchers, it's difficult for them to kind of pull out and focus in and pull out and focus in. Again, there's no judgment. It's kind of where you stand. We have the drive category. We have the leadership category, the team ability category, the service category. A couple of interesting ones, I think controversial ones that we can talk about. In the drive category, for example, there's narcissism. Narcissism is an interesting one, and I had a little bit of consternation kind of figuring out what kind of, whether or not this attribute was something that we should talk about. I ultimately decided it is, because I realized I was tied up with the clinical definition of narcissism, which is a bad thing, of course, but only 6% of folks have that clinical definition, rather than the generalized definition of narcissism. Okay, generalized narcissism is just literally, quite simply, the desire to stand out, be adored, be recognized. Every single human being on this planet at some point in their lives wants to stand out, be adored, be recognized. So we all have an element of narcissism. In fact, it is one of the most powerful drivers for us as human beings. I mean, why else would you want to be a Navy SEAL or the best podcaster, an author, or a best surgeon, right? It's a little bit of narcissism. That's okay. We just have to understand what it is and metabolize it appropriately. So I think that's something that we also need to think about. Some of these things that we tend to eschew and say, no, that's not me. It's better if we embrace them and say, okay, wait, actually part of that is me, and how can I actually metabolize it in a positive way? So those are some of the fun ones. I mean, there's 41. You and I could spend 3 hours talking about every one, but I'll stop there. I don't know if there were any you read about that you were particularly curious about. So.
Well, I love these ones, and I appreciate that you unpacked the narcissism one, because that was definitely like, oh, what is this chapter now going to be about? This is interesting. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is how, you started off by saying these are like a dimmer switch, right? Where we can kind of go from 0 to 7 or 0 to 100. But then there were a handful of them that actually have a negative side to them, meaning you could kind of go past 0 into the -1, -2 zone. And can you kind of share what those ones are? And why is it that there are certain things that are more like a scale, and some things where actually there does seem to be this broader spectrum where you can kind of almost be on either side of it?
Yeah. Well, so I will say that I think I would make an argument that any of the attributes at an extreme, whether high extreme or low extreme, is a bad thing. And we could pick any attribute and make an argument for that. But just take adaptability, for example. Okay, extremely, like, too much adaptability means you're the limp noodle and you just flowing and flexing to everything. There's no backbone there, right? Whereas obviously we know that too little adaptability means you're stiff as a board and you're gonna break at some point. But we can make that argument with anyone. Now there are a few though that like you said, whether you're high or low doesn't really matter as much when it comes to success. In other words, so patience is one of these, right? In other words, there are highly successful people who are really impatient, and there are highly successful people who are really patient. There are highly successful people who are very competitive. There are highly successful people who aren't competitive at all, right? So these are a couple attributes where you start to look at the polarities and you say, well, regardless of where I fall on these, I can make it work very expertly because that's just who I am. And there's no real reason to change it. In those cases, what you want to do oftentimes is make sure that you have people on your team that represent the opposite polarity, because that's when teaming becomes the most powerful. I always define a high-performing team as any group of 2 or more people that are working together towards a common goal or objective. But that's the first part. The second caveat, which is very important, is that not only perform when things are going great, but also when things are not going great. Okay, so a high-performing team can be found in a SEAL team, an athletic team, even a business team. But a high-performing team can be a great marriage. A high-performing team can be a group of friends on a trip. It can be a group of people working on a project at church, right? My wife and I, we've been married for 24 years. We've lived the war together. We have 2 teenage boys. We consider ourselves a high-performing team. And when we look at our attributes, it's interesting how they mesh and flow. My wife is a very impatient person, okay? I am a very patient person. And that's worked beautifully for us in the last 24 years of marriage, because when patience has been required, I step up and lead. When impatience is required, she steps up and leads, right? And my patience has prevented her from making decisions too quickly or running into the burning building too fast, whereas her impatience has prevented me from procrastinating, maybe not moving fast enough. Okay, so the same thing happens with competitiveness and non-competitiveness. And so I think some of these attributes, what we want to look at is, yes, we can, if we're low on an attribute, we can certainly improve it, and we may want to improve it, but sometimes you don't have to. You just have to, in a team environment, make sure you have that polarity represented, and you'll move and flow expertly. So
your marriage sounds very much like mine. Well, let's talk a little bit about how do you make these changes? Like, how do you improve it? If you've realized, like I will say for myself, I'm probably a little bit too adaptable sometimes, and maybe I want to get a little less adaptable. So if you have, done some self-reflection, or you've kind of gotten feedback and you kind of know, yeah, maybe I'm not quite as patient as I should be with my team, or I'm not as decisive as I really should be. And then people end up kind of waiting around for me to make these final decisions before the team can move forward. And I really want to improve those things. What is it that we might be able to do to start to push that dimmer switch in the right direction?
Yeah, so there's three things that that need to happen if you want to improve an attribute. Okay, the first one is you have to know that you're low on it. Okay. The second one is you have to have a motivation, desire, or need to improve it. And the reason why that's important is because I want to just emphasize, just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you need to improve it. In fact, being low on an attribute might be perfect for your specific niche in what you're doing. I always kind of say that the comedian who has too much empathy is going to be a lousy comedian, right? And so you want to make sure that just because you're low is like, okay, will improving this attribute in fact help the specific niche or goal that I'm in? Okay. If the answer is yes, you know that you're low on it, then you say, yes, I do want to improve it. The third one is the most important. You have to go find and seek out environments that deliberately test and tease that attribute, whatever that might look like for you. So if you want to develop your patience, you have to go find environments that test and tease your patience. Again, whatever that looks like. It could be, I'm going to go deliberately drive in traffic. I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in. I always say having kids, that'll develop patience, right? But whatever that is, you can do that with any attribute. You can go find environments that test and tease that attribute. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to feel uncertain. It's going to feel challenging, but that's the point. And if you do that, if you consistently put yourself in those environments, you will slowly develop that attribute. You'll work towards that, and it'll come up in the score. So that's the way you can do it if you need to. But again, I would offer when people, and I know you're going to point people to our website, and we have an attribute assessments, 41 attributes assessment people can take. I want to tell people, just because you have maybe a bottom 5 or you're low on some, you really have to put some thought into, okay, which ones do I want to develop? And that list should not be long. It should be maybe 1 or 2, because developing an attribute does take work, and pick the ones that you think are the most important, develop those, but then, stack some team members around you to to support the other ones you're low on.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Well, let's talk about teams for a second here. When you are looking at your team, if you're kind of trying to assess the team's individual attributes or kind of collective attributes, can you help somebody else improve an attribute, right? If you kind of know, like, wow, you are doing so great in this job, except this one challenging area, and I don't want to have to move you out of the role, right? Like, what can you actually help somebody else improve an attribute, or is that kind of barking up the wrong tree?
I think you can, but the way you do it is you might, especially as leaders or managers, you can say you can help them understand where they sit. So that's one way you can help, maybe giving them an assessment or help them do that. Then you can help them with an understanding of why they might want to develop the motivation. Obviously, you can't make them motivated, but you can help them maybe be motivated to develop it. And if then they say, yes, I want to develop it, then you can help them with environments inside of which they develop. As leaders and managers, we can put people into environments. Okay, listen, you want to develop this? Here's a job, here's a task that is going to really develop this, right? So that's the way you can help them. You can't necessarily teach them, again, or train them. And again, the real quick way to determine whether or not you're dealing with an attribute or a skill is to ask a very simple question. The question is, can I teach it or can it be taught? Okay. If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So someone could say, hey, Rich, I want to learn how to skydive. Okay. Well, I could take someone out and teach them how to skydive. That's a skill, right? Or someone could say, Rich, I want to learn how to be more patient. I can't teach someone how to be more patient. That's something that has to be self-developed. But what I can do as a leader is I could say, listen, you're interested in developing this. I'm going to throw you in some environments. I'm going to put you in some positions that are going to test your patience. So here's a chance to develop that.
It feels like such a great opportunity for us as managers to give our team members new experiences in the workplace, right? Like it's one thing, as you're saying, to like and have them enroll in the class or read a book or go to a conference. It's a very different thing to be like, I'm going to put you on this project, and it might be challenging in some of these ways, right? It might require much more focus than you're used to having, or or learning how to task switch better because you've got a couple of different things happening all at once, right? And like that's a great opportunity for us to really support our people in expanding their experiences, and also can be a little challenging for us as managers to be like, okay, I'm going to go put someone in a situation I know is going to be challenging for them, and to have the courage and the willingness and the support to help them be successful in those spaces, both in the learning that they're trying to do, the growing and the stretching, and the work itself, right? Because we don't want the work to suffer.
As managers, we're leaders, and we know it's not necessarily about managing people or the people. It's managing the environment so that people can excel and succeed, and that's really our job. And I think certainly as a leader in the Navy, it was one of those things that, hey, I knew that my job was to ensure that there was an environment so that the team could become more than it ever imagined. And I always told my junior officers, I said, hey, you have to understand the irony of leadership. The irony of leadership is if you do your job correctly, you work yourself out of a job because you create a team that can actually run without you. Obviously, a necessity in the military because in combat, anything can happen. But even in the work environment, it's something that, hey, if you create a team that outruns you, you've just shown yourself to be someone who is absolutely astute at this type of leadership, and it will be recognized. And it also be recognized with the people who are in your span of care, and that's really the most important thing.
Hard to do, but
yes, yeah.
But amazing when you do it. All right, we are about to wrap up. So, Rich, can you tell us about a great manager that you worked for and what made this person such a fabulous boss?
Yeah, I'm gonna give an example that might sound a little counterintuitive, but you read about this person in the book. It was on the authenticity chapter, and this leader was someone who I when I first met, he was my commanding officer, and he came across as very grumpy and always asking tough questions, right, or hard questions. And I remember the first couple minutes of meeting him, I was like, man, this is going to be a tough tour with him as my boss. But what I recognized in short order about a week or so is that he was like that with everybody. He was always grumpy and he was always asking tough questions. And that's the definition of authenticity as an attribute, by the way. But what that meant was I trusted what I was going to get. I knew exactly what I was going to get with this guy. And he made me a better officer because I knew every time I was going to see him, I said, I need to have my stuff together because he's going to ask me tough questions and he's going to not be nice about it. He ended up being one of my favorite leaders because he pushed me and I trusted what I was going to get every time. And even today, I still keep in touch with him. We're part of a Navy SEAL book club. A bunch of us SEALs, retired guys, all the way to active guys. We read books and get on Zoom and discuss it. He's part of that book club. And when he gets on the Zoom and he talks about the book, he's still grumpy and he's still asking tough questions and he's still consistent. I still trust him deeply. And I think the leaders that were so meaningful for me were the ones that I trusted deeply. And they didn't have to be necessarily nice and flowery and all that stuff, but they were consistent. And I knew what I was going to get. And I knew this is important. I knew they were that way because they cared about me. It wasn't because they were just being mean people or they really did care. And so I think those are the leaders that really affected me the most. There's
something that's really magical when you know that your boss is just who they are and they're like that all the time with everyone. And like that is just like, it's a really special thing to be able to show up as yourself in the workplace, consistently in that way. And so I love that he was just like, yeah, I'm just a grumpy guy and ask tough questions. And like, it's who I am.
That's
Love
right.
this. Okay. And then lastly, where can people learn more about you? Tell us the name of your book and where people can find it and all that jazz.
Yeah. So the book is The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance. And you can find it on Amazon and in most of the bookstores. Amazon's probably the best, but also our website at theattributes.com. And that's all one word, theattributes.com. And there you can find us. You can find all the stuff we do. We have, like I said, we have a attributes assessment where you can get tested on all 41 attributes. You can get a ranked order of of how you stand on the attributes and say, okay, this is what I'm highest on, this is what I'm lowest on, and really give you a chance to introspect. So you can find us there. And of course, we do work with teams and organizations to help them figure out how to hire better, how to tweak their hiring processes to be more effective. So theattributes.com. And yeah, the book is on Amazon. So.
Awesome. Do you want to leave us with one final tip or trick or thought around how we can really leverage these insights that you've generated through the attributes?
I would just say, I've always encouraged, even when I was, in leading people, but I do it with my own kids, is I think one of the most important things we can do is develop good habits of introspection and be able to quite often just turn inward and ask ourselves honest and thoughtful questions about our own behavior, our own performance, because I think those types of interrogations are extraordinarily powerful. They allow us to remain humble, and they are the impetus to growth. And so, develop good habits of introspection. Figure out who we are, figure out who you are, figure out why you do what you do. Don't judge it, just live with it and grow. And it's good stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Rich. Really a pleasure. And I'm now so excited to go learn about the other 20 some attributes that I didn't get to learn about in the book.
Great. Well, thank you. There's great chatting. So thanks for having me.